This might be the last mock of the year before we get into the year of mocks, 2023 for the draft. Ryan Wilson's top 10 here has Bryce Young going number 1 to the Texans. Bunch of players, though, in this top 10 who are going to be playing in the college football playoff semifinals this Saturday, including a couple from Georgia. Jalen Carter, number 2 to the Bears, and C.J. Stroud, number 8 to Ohio State. To the Carolina Panthers out of Ohio State. Let's get Ryan Wilson in here and let's focus on the team Ohio State's playing. The Georgia Bulldogs, they lead the way with 5 players in your first round, and that would tie last year's mark, 5 players in the first round. Last year, though, all of them came from the defensive side.
That's right, Chris. And look, there could be a situation where they have another young man named DeJuan Jones who plays on the offensive line for Ohio State find his way into the first round as well. We'll wait and see how that plays out. But this roster is absolutely stacked. DeJuan Jones is Ohio State. We're talking Georgia here. So, right, Jalen Carter, it starts with him at number 2. He's probably the best player in this draft, and this draft also includes Will Anderson, which is a fun conversation to have. You mentioned the 5 players last year out of Georgia drafted in round 1. He might be the best player of both those teams the last 2 years. Kaylee Ringo is going to be one of the first cornerbacks taken, if not the first cornerback taken. He's big, he's physical, he's fast. He makes a lot of plays at the catch point. You see Nolan Smith there. He's out with a pectoral injury. Undersized for an edge rusher in terms of what he weighs. When you see him play, he plays much bigger than that. He's not asked to do much in terms of pass coverage, but he rushes the passers like no one else's business. So that'll be fun to watch. And Broderick Jones and Darnell Washington, I lumped them together because they could both be considered offensive linemen. Broderick Jones is actually an offensive lineman in terms of where he's listed as position. Darnell Washington is about 6'5", 265, the best blocking tight end in this class, and he adds an extra element as a pass catcher. He's just grown into that role. He's a middle of the field threat, no doubt about it. Huge catch radius, no surprise there. Long strider, but as I mentioned, blocking is what he does best, and he's going to grow into that role as an offensive weapon when he gets into the league, Chris.
Ryan, I want to circle back to your first point on Jalen Carter. You have him going number 2 overall to the Bears, but the top defensive player off the board in your latest mock. Why do you feel, and why do some feel, that he has surpassed Will Anderson of Alabama?
It's probably unfair to Will Anderson because Will Anderson has such a fantastic season in 2021. Saw a lot of double teams and even triple teams in terms of chips at times coming out of the backfield. Wasn't quite as productive stats-wise on the field, but he certainly was dominant at times. Jalen Carter, meanwhile, battled an ankle injury this year, but when he was on the field, he is unstoppable. And I say that with the full understanding that he played with Jordan Davis last year, who was also unstoppable. Jalen Carter is actually somehow a better athlete at that size than his former teammate who went to the Philadelphia Eagles in round 1. And I think both these guys are layups. If you're a general manager looking to make a selection and feel secure about your job the next day, Jalen Carter might be the easier of the 2 layups. Perhaps it's a right-handed layup if you're right-handed as opposed to trying to fancy left-handed layup with Will Anderson. Either way, you can't go wrong, especially with the uncertainty that comes with drafting a quarterback so high. You don't really know how that's going to work out. You have a pretty good idea how Jalen Carter and Will Anderson are going to work out. I'll call them 1A and 1B because they both feel like pretty solid picks.
Georgia with 3 defensive players in your first round mock. Ohio State with 3 offensive players in your first round mock, which is why many of us are salivating about this matchup. Your first off the board for Ohio State is C.J. Stroud, 8th to the Panthers.
Yeah, and this is where DeJuan Jones goes if he were to sneak into the first round as well for Ohio State. So they could possibly have 4. We'll start with C.J. Stroud, though, the quarterback. I was talking to a scout earlier this week, and he's in the QB1 conversation. And he's in the QB1 conversation not with Bryce Young, my guy, but with Will Levis. That's a conversation for another time, of course. We heard BMAC talk about this earlier in the segment. He has to play better than he did in that Michigan game, and I think he's going to show up. There's a lot of teams that love C.J. Stroud. Oddly, he's flown under the radar in terms of the quarterback conversation as it pertains to the draft. I think he'll make a statement here. Paris Johnson is going to be one of the first offensive tackles off the board. And the great thing about Paris Johnson, in addition to having a great season, He can kick inside. He played inside last year at times, so he has that versatility if he's going to an NFL team that has their offensive tackle set for the next year or two, and then he can kick outside once those contracts expire. Jackson Smith-Njigba is going to be interesting. He's not playing in this game. He has an injury, and he's already declared for the draft. Only played 3 games and a handful of snaps. He is not the athlete as of Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, who he played with last season, both first-round picks, but he does a lot of things well out of the slot, and he'll be fun to watch once we get through the pre-draft process. Hopefully he'll be able to contribute or take part, in some of those things.
And again, as you mentioned, Jackson Smith-Njigba not going to play in the semifinal or the championship. He is done for the season for Ohio State. Let's move on to the other semifinal, TCU and Michigan. Not as many top flight NFL prospects in that one, but TCU might have the top wide receiver prospect in Quentin Johnston.
Yeah, we heard Dennis Dodd just talk about all that Quentin Johnston's done this year. And the season's been up and down in part because of the ankle injury. But when it's up, it is way up. And he's 6'4", 200 plus. When he's healthy, he's going to run a blazing time. And he does everything. He does it at all 3 levels, short, intermediate, deep. He's a yak guy in terms of yards after the catch. He's a catch the ball over everyone else guy and run into the end zone. He's whatever you need him to be. And for that size, he plays with the speed and quickness in short areas like he's about 5'11" and a 4'4" guy. So he's a throw it up and go get it guy. Max Duggan can certainly attest to as much. They don't have anyone else likely to go in the first round. It would be a surprise if they do, but they have plenty of guys that are going to get drafted that are going to play in this football game. But it starts with Quentin Johnston. He's my wide receiver 1. When I talked to Brady on Mondays during our draft segment, he likes Jordan Addison out of USC a little better. We'll see how that plays out in the coming weeks and months as we get closer to the actual draft.
TCU didn't have anybody drafted at all last season, but a lot of them came back, really good college players like a Max Duggan. That's why they're in this position against Michigan. And surprisingly, Michigan doesn't have anybody in your first round. Who's their top pro prospect, though, in your mind?
This is going to be interesting, Chris, because it starts with Mazi Smith, the interior defensive lineman, and we heard conversations about that earlier from Dennis Dodd as well. Now, this guy is freakishly athletic. He's 6'3", 226-ish, and he moves like he's a much smaller human being. The issue is that for all the athleticism that he possesses, it doesn't show up consistently on tape. And I know I've talked to scouts that wanted to see more of that over the course of the fall. Now, it only takes one team to fall in love with those traits and perhaps take a flyer in the first round on him. I think he's more likely to be a day 2 guy, but we'll see how that plays out. DJ Turner is a defensive back who could be a day 2 prospect. He's 6 foot, about 180. He does a lot of things well down the field because of that length. And Blake Corum, unfortunately, isn't playing because of the knee injury suffered against Illinois. But he's an explosive running back and one of the most important pieces to that offense, in addition to Roddy Bell, who is their big play receiver on the outside. Not necessarily a speed demon or going to beat you in short areas, but he's a down the field threat who's consistent and been a part of that offense when they put the ball in the air. So last year, their first-round pick, Aiden Hutchinson, turned out to be pretty good. Dax Hill was also drafted in the first round by the Bengals. This year, it'll be a stretch to see someone go in round 1, Chris.
Ryan, even though Michigan does not have a first-round pick, they do have talent, but not the top-flight talent of some of the other teams on the other side of the bracket, like a Georgia, like an Ohio State. They did beat Ohio State last season and at the end of this regular season, but what we saw on the field in the semifinal last year was that Georgia just had too much talent for them. Why doesn't Michigan have more top-flight players in your mind? What are they missing?
Well, I think it's just a product of the recruiting process, and we know that the best players, in large part, typically end up in the SEC. You get flashes at Ohio State, that might be the exception, but even, with all respect to Brady Quinn, even the Notre Dames of the world find it a little more difficult to recruit, either because of academic issues in terms of standards, or just because players like playing in warm weather. And now with NIL, things have certainly changed. But it is a true testament to what Harbaugh has been able to do at Michigan and turning that program around, and I think in large part is why he's going to get a lot of interest again this offseason in the NFL for those abilities, which he obviously did at Michigan, but he did prior to that at Stanford, San Diego State, and then, of course, in between in the NFL when he was in San Francisco. He's able to do it with players that aren't all 5 stars, aren't all top 10 picks. That said, Aiden Hutchinson made a pretty good career for himself at Michigan and was able to go second overall. We mentioned Dax Hill. David Ajabo had a chance to sneak into the first round, went into the second round after he tore his Achilles during his pro day last year. Also a dynamic player. So I think it's a mix of those things, but I'm not sleeping on Michigan in terms of this weekend or going forward as long as Harbaugh is there, because they seem to get those players, and those players play hard for them, and they always show up at the end of the season.
Ryan Wilson here on CBS Sports HQ. You can check out his latest mock at cbssports.com, and you can hear him on his new podcast, With the First Pick. Ryan joined by Rick Spielman, longtime NFL GM.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.